Hello everyone and welcome to another raw umber video. I'm Lizet Dingemans and this will be a little video on how to measure. I like to think of drawing and painting in two parts. You have the technical bit, which is to do with what materials to use and how to also use them. I did an intro on this last week, so have a look if you're interested. But the second part is what I like to think of as the more artistic bit. And this is more what to do with what are you going to draw with these materials. For instance, it doesn't matter if you use paint or pencil or charcoal, the measurements of that portrait that you're drawing will always be the same, so you need to know how to measure those. In this tutorial, I'm going to take you through how to observe and how to measure in order to get better observational drawing. Drawing is actually half observing, and when you're observing, you have to start categorizing what's important to draw, where to start, and what's also very important to leave out. And that's what we're going to be learning today. So let's start with the real basics. As you can see, I've just drawn an angled line on the paper. So if you want to draw that angle, you need to know exactly where it's pointing at. This can be hard to do on its own, but what if you add a horizontal or a vertical line to it? As you can see, the minute I add that horizontal and vertical axis, it's much easier to judge the difference between the angle and the vertical line. Another thing you can do that helps me is imagine the angle is the hand of a clock. As you can see, my angle is pointed at around 7 o'clock. At first you can maybe draw these circle lines and the horizontal and vertical lines in, but of course that's not really practical to do for every angle you want to draw. What will happen is after a while your brain will sort of train itself to see these lines without needing to actually see them. Practice makes perfect. So let's pretend for a second that this whole circle with the angle is the picture I want to copy. The easiest way to start is with the top and bottom. So the way to measure those is to hold your pencil, keep your elbow locked and your wrist also quite stiff, and put the point of the pencil on the top line and your thumb near the bottom line of your object or portrait. And then you can just take your pencil over to where your paper is and draw a line where the top of your pencil is and a line where your thumb is located. This way of drawing, where you're copying directly what you see in the same size, is called side size and it's used in a lot of ateliers. It's really useful in the sense that if your object that you're drawing is just next to your paper, like for instance my circle is now next to my circle I'm drawing right now, it's really easy to see if you've made it a little bit too tall or a little bit too wide, because you can just flick your eye back and forth. So it's a really good way to learn. So let's try the same way with something a little bit more complicated. Well, let's try just drawing just a random scribble and see if we can copy it using this method. So that looks pretty complicated, but what if we just start by just adding that vertical and horizontal line? By putting the shape in a box like that, we can easily measure the top versus the width and just take that over to copy. So once again, I'm going to start by measuring using the top of my pencil and my thumb for the width and as well for the height. You can also use another straight object for this, so for instance a knitting needle or a cocktail stick. So this is like how I like to fill in the other shapes. So if you just look at the left chunk there, it's about 1/3 up where it starts and 1/3 down where it ends. So you can just sort of take those lines and bring them into your box as well. And that's how you can break down shapes and copy them accurately. Now this is really useful in the portrait and actually anything you draw. So I would say if you've got a bit of time after this, just spend a little bit of time just copying your own squiggles. And you'll see that this will help with anything you draw, from trees to portraiture to anything you're drawing from observation. If you work from big to small shapes, it's always much easier to sort of hang the little shapes from the bigger shapes rather than have to work around the little shapes to then put the big shapes in. I just want to talk really quick about common mistakes using this method of drawing. When you first start measuring, you base off your measurements of the first line. So your first line is wrong. You may think that this angle is right, and then you might hang off other angles from that. And slowly you get a sort of chain effect where your whole drawing is off. Like for instance, in this little one that I'm doing underneath, you can see I started with the first angle being slightly off and everything else is now angled a little bit more than it should. So the best way to tackle that is by never trusting your own lines and to measure everything from as many different viewpoints as possible. Once you get more versed in these angles, it becomes more of a second nature to you. You'll be able to draw more easily, draw shapes more easily, and for instance, draw a box quite quickly. Okay, so for the last bit of the video, for the last 3 minutes, I just want to get into what if you don't have your portrait next to your drawing and you can draw it in the same size. For instance, you want to make your drawing a little bit bigger than the photo you have. Well, in that case, the same method applies, but instead of doing side size, so taking over the exact measurement, we're going to look at using comparative. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of compare the width to the height and try and emulate that on a bigger scale. So we're just going to look at how the width measures up, and then we're going to just make our pencil a little bit bigger by having it close to our face and then comparing how that relates to the height. So as you can see, I always start by sketching something and then correcting my lines as I go. So checking again, now it seems like it's a little bit better. Don't worry if it's not exact, it's quick draw after all, so let's just get it somehow okay and then move on. Now, once I've got my big box in, the rest is just copying what we did before, looking at, is this point halfway of the box, 1/3 down the box? How does the angle compare to the vertical and the horizontal lines? And that's just how you draw any shape. Okay, so just a little final note about this. When you first start learning about measuring, you think you have to measure everything, and it can get a bit difficult to draw quickly. I would advise actually not to measure everything. Draw first, measure second. You might be surprised by how far off you are, and you might think, oh my god, I'm really bad at drawing, blah, blah, blah. The main thing is that every time your eye sees that it was wrong using the measurement, you train your eye to be more accurate. So the more you draw and then measure and correct yourself, the more accurate your eye becomes and the easier drawing will be. Okay, so if I can give you a little bit of homework, that would be draw as many scribbles or objects as you like and try using these comparative or side size measurements and see how it improves your eye. I'll link some of my sources down below, including the Bargue book which I mentioned. See you next week!